He thought the biggest threat was the 5 men walking toward his table, but he was about to realize he had been ignoring the only person who truly mattered. The restaurant glowed in warm amber light, crystal glasses catching reflections from chandeliers above, the quiet hum of low conversation blending with the soft clink of silverware against porcelain. Everything controlled, elegant, predictable, just the way Vincent Romano preferred it. A man who built his empire on precision, on reading people before they even spoke, on never being surprised. And yet tonight, something fell off in a way he couldn't quite name, like a note slightly out of tune. In an otherwise perfect symphony, his dark eyes scanning the room without moving his head, always observing, always calculating, while across the polished marble floor, unnoticed by nearly everyone, Amara Johnson moved silently between tables, her worn black uniform blending into the background, her presence as invisible as the shadows stretching along the walls. The kind of employee people forgot existed until something went wrong, her hands steady as she cleared plates, her gaze lowered not out of submission but out of habit, the habit of someone who had learned long ago that attention could be dangerous. Earlier that evening the manager's voice had cut through the air sharp and dismissive, reminding her in front of a table of well-dressed guests to move faster, to stay out of sight, to remember her place. And she had nodded quietly, absorbing the words without reaction, her face calm, her posture unchanged. But there had been something in her eyes for just a second, something that didn't belong to a maid, something older, harder, something no one bothered to notice, not even Vincent, who had glanced once in her direction before returning to his conversation, dismissing her as part of the environment, another background detail in a world designed to serve him. And yet, just minutes before the evening shifted, Amara had paused beside a small table near the window where a young boy sat trembling, overwhelmed by the noise and movement around him, his mother whispering, gently, trying to calm him, and without hesitation. Amara had crouched beside him, her voice soft, steady, guiding him to focus on a simple rhythm, a quiet hum barely audible beneath the music, her movements precise, controlled, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. And within moments the boy's breathing slowed, his shoulders relaxed, his small world settling back into place. And then she stood, returning to invisibility as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just restored calm with nothing but presence and control. And it was. In that same moment, as Vincent lifted his glass and the room seemed to exhale into comfort, that 5 men entered the restaurant, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet purpose that didn't match the elegance around them. Their steps measured, their eyes fixed, and though no one else seemed to notice, Amara did, her gaze lifting for the first time, locking onto the subtle shift in the air, the way conversations faltered just slightly, the way tension crept in like a shadow no one could see yet. And in that instant, something inside her changed, the softness in her posture replaced by something sharper, something alert, as if a switch had been flipped deep within her, while across the room Vincent remained seated, unaware that control was slipping from his grasp, unaware that the night he thought he understood was already rewriting itself, and the only person who saw it coming was the one he had never truly seen at all. The first man stopped 3 steps from Vincent's table, not close enough to draw attention, but not far enough to be accidental, his posture too deliberate, his eyes too still, and Vincent felt it then. That subtle fracture in the rhythm of the room, the kind that only men like him were trained to notice, his fingers pausing against the stem of his glass as his gaze lifted slightly, not enough to alarm anyone, just enough to assess. But before his mind could complete the pattern, another man shifted behind him, then another to the left, and suddenly the elegant symmetry of the dining room had been quietly rearranged into something far more intentional, something controlled by someone else. And for the first time that night, Vincent Romano was not the one in control. Across the room a couple laughed too loudly, unaware of the invisible lines being drawn around them. A server passed by carrying a tray, unaware that the air had thickened, that something was about to break the illusion of safety that wealth and marble floors created. And in the center of it all, Amara stood still, completely still, her hand resting lightly against the edge of a table as her eyes tracked movement no one else registered. 5 positions, 5 angles, 5 points. Closing in with precision that spoke of planning, not impulse. Her breathing remained steady, but her mind moved fast, mapping distance, exits, obstacles, timing, and most importantly, intent, because she had seen this before, not here, not in a place filled with candlelight and fine wine, but in environments where mistakes were not forgiven and hesitation meant loss. And she recognized the pattern instantly. The staggered approach, the synchronized pacing, the way each man avoided eye contact with the others while still moving in harmony. It was not chaos. It was structure disguised as coincidence. Vincent's chair shifted slightly as he adjusted his posture, his instinct finally catching up to what his environment was trying to tell him, his gaze sharpening as it swept the room again, landing briefly on the nearest man, then flicking to the mirrored wall where reflections told him more than direct observation ever could. But even then, even with all his experience, he was a step behind, because he was reacting, and Amara was already ahead. Her eyes flicked once toward the main entrance, calculating the distance, then toward the kitchen corridor, noting the narrow passage that could become either a trap or an escape. Her fingers curled slightly, not from fear but from readiness, a readiness she had buried beneath years of silence. And in that moment, the world around her shifted from background noise to active terrain, every table a barrier, every chair a potential obstacle, every second a decision point. And still, no one noticed her, not the guests, not the staff, and certainly not Vincent, who was now fully aware that something was wrong but had not yet identified what. His attention drawn to the man in front of him whose polite expression did not quite reach his eyes. A man who looked like any other guest but carried himself like someone who had already decided how the night would end. And just as Vincent's hand moved subtly toward his jacket, the man took one final step forward, closing the distance. And in that exact same heartbeat, Amara moved, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but just enough to change her position by a few inches, aligning herself with a path no one else could see, because she knew something Vincent did not, something he could not know yet, that the real danger was not the man standing in front of him, but the timing of the ones he could not see, and that if no one intervened in the next few seconds, control would not just shift, it would disappear entirely. Vincent's fingers hovered just inside his jacket, not reaching, not committing, because something in the man's posture in front of him did not match the final move. It felt too early, too obvious, like a distraction meant to pull focus away from something else. And that realization came a fraction too late, because behind him, slightly to the right, one of the other men adjusted his stance by less than an inch, but it was enough. Enough for someone trained to see patterns to understand that the sequence had already begun, and in that same instant, Amara's mind completed the equation. 5 positions, 3 lines of movement, 1 central target. Vincent was not just surrounded, he was being guided into stillness, into hesitation, into the exact moment where reaction would be slower than intention, and that was the moment everything would be decided. Her gaze sharpened as she tracked the man behind Vincent through the reflection in a polished silver tray resting on a nearby table. The angle was imperfect, distorted, but it gave her just enough, a shift of weight, a subtle alignment of shoulders, a signal invisible to anyone not looking for it. And she exhaled slowly, grounding herself, because she knew what came next, not from this room, not from these men, but from a life she had buried beneath quiet routines and lowered eyes. A life where rooms were not safe, where every entrance had 2 exits and every face was a potential threat. Her hand moved without hesitation, not toward anything dramatic, not toward anything that would draw attention, but toward the tray itself, her fingers adjusting its position by less than an inch, aligning it with the reflection she needed. And then she stepped forward, just 1 step, placing herself into a path that no one else recognized as significant. Vincent's attention locked onto the man in front of him, his instincts now fully engaged, his mind calculating options, distance, timing, but he was still reacting, still trying to catch up to a situation that had already been set in motion. And that was when Amara acted, not with force, not with noise, but with precision so subtle it almost looked accidental. Her arm extended as if to clear a glass, her movement smooth, controlled, and in that motion, she shifted the angle of the tray just enough to catch the light from above and redirect it. A brief flash, barely noticeable, but perfectly timed, striking the eyes of the man behind Vincent at the exact second he needed visual confirmation. And that single disruption was enough. His timing faltered, his step delayed by less than a second. But in a sequence built on synchronization, less than a second was everything. Vincent felt it before he understood it, the rhythm breaking, the invisible coordination slipping, his body reacting instinctively now, his chair moving slightly as he repositioned, creating space where there had been none, his eyes narrowing as he caught the reflection of movement behind him. And for the first time, he saw it clearly, not just one man, but all of them, their positions no longer perfectly aligned, their control fractured, and his gaze snapped to the side, landing on Amara for a brief moment, just a second. But in that second, something did not match. She was not panicked, not frozen like the other staff. Her posture was steady, her eyes focused, not on the chaos, but on the pattern, and Vincent felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, not fear, but recognition, the kind that comes when you realize someone else in the room understands the game you are playing and understands it just as well as you do. Amara did not look at him again. She did not need to, her attention already moving ahead, recalculating, because the disruption she created was not enough to end it, only enough to change it. And now the sequence would adapt, the men would adjust, and the danger would not disappear, it would evolve. And she knew that the next move would not give her the same advantage, which meant the next decision had to be faster, sharper, and far more visible than anything she had done so far, because the moment for subtlety was closing, and what came next would reveal exactly who she really was. The room did not erupt into chaos, not yet, because the illusion of control was still holding by a thread, conversations faltering into uneasy silence, forks pausing midair, eyes beginning to shift toward the subtle tension that had no obvious source. And in that fragile moment, the 5 men adjusted, their formation no longer perfect but still dangerous, their awareness sharpening as they sensed the disruption without fully understanding its origin. And Vincent felt it too, the shift from a clean execution to something uncertain, something unpredictable, his instincts no longer warning him of an imminent end, but of a situation that could still be turned if he moved at exactly the right time. And yet, even as his mind recalculated, he realized something that unsettled him more than the threat itself. He was no longer the one dictating the pace. Someone else had already interfered. Someone else had already seen what he had missed, and his eyes found her again, not by chance, but by instinct. Amara stood 2 tables away now, no longer blending into the background, no longer just another shadow moving between guests, her posture different, her presence anchored in a way that drew attention without asking for it. And for a brief second, the world narrowed to that single realization. She was not reacting, she was orchestrating. Amara's mind moved faster now, the window for subtle corrections closing with every second. The men were adapting, spacing themselves differently, abandoning the clean symmetry for something more fluid, more aggressive, and she knew that meant their next move would not rely on precision, it would rely on speed, which meant she could no longer control them indirectly. She would have to intervene in a way that could not be ignored. Her gaze swept the room one last time, confirming positions, distances, the location of the nearest exit, the placement of every table and chair within 10 feet, her breathing steady, her movements calculated. And then she stepped forward again, not quietly this time, not invisibly, but with intention, her hand reaching for the edge of a nearby service cart, the wheels barely making a sound as she shifted it just enough to alter the space between Vincent and the man approaching him. A small adjustment, almost imperceptible, but it changed the geometry of the moment, forcing the man to hesitate, to recalculate his path. And hesitation was something Amara could use. Vincent saw it happen, the smallest interruption, the kind most people would dismiss as coincidence. But he did not dismiss it. Not anymore. Because twice now the rhythm had broken in ways that did not align with chance, and twice now she had been in the center of it, his perception sharpening, his attention splitting between the men surrounding him and the woman who was no longer invisible. And then it happened, not an explosion, not a sudden act, but a shift in intent so clear it cut through the silence like a blade. One of the men moved faster than the others, abandoning the coordinated timing in favor of direct action. And that was the moment Amara had been waiting for, because speed created openings that precision did not. Her body moved without hesitation, stepping into the line of motion not as a barrier, but as a disruption, her arm extending as if to steady the cart. Her movement intersecting his path just enough to force him off balance without drawing attention to the action itself. A collision disguised as an accident, a correction hidden within routine, and in that instant, the entire sequence unraveled, the remaining men forced to adjust again, their control slipping further, their plan no longer synchronized. Vincent did not wait this time. The moment she created was enough, his body shifting decisively, creating distance, breaking the containment that had been closing around him, his eyes locking onto hers for a fraction of a second. And this time there was no confusion, no dismissal, only recognition, because whatever she was, whatever she had been before this night, she was no longer just a maid. And for the first time in years, Vincent Romano found himself following someone else's lead. The illusion finally shattered, not in a burst of noise, but in the way every eye in the room began to turn at once. Conversations collapsing into silence as awareness spread like a ripple across the polished floor, and in that silence, control no longer belonged to the 5 men who had entered with quiet precision. It belonged to the disruption they could not predict. Vincent moved with intention now, no longer seated, no longer contained. His body angled away from the tightening circle, his steps measured, deliberate, not retreating but repositioning. And every movement he made was shaped by the space Amara had created, every inch of distance a direct result of her unseen calculations. She did not look at him, not again, because she did not need to. Her focus remained on the shifting pattern in front of her. The men were no longer synchronized, their confidence fractured by hesitation, their attention divided between their target and the unexpected interference they could not identify. And that confusion was the only advantage she had left. Her mind mapped their adjustments in real time, one stepping wider to compensate, another tightening his angle, a third hesitating just long enough to reveal uncertainty. And she moved accordingly, not aggressively, not dramatically, but with purpose that cut through the noise of the room, her hand brushing the edge of a chair, turning it slightly, changing a pathway, her foot guiding a small obstacle into a line that forced a wider step, every action subtle, every movement disguised as routine, yet each one altering the outcome by fractions that added up to control. Vincent saw it now, not the individual actions, but the effect, the way the room itself seemed to resist the men closing in, the way their movements no longer aligned with intent. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to trust something outside his own command, not blindly, but with calculated acceptance, because whoever she was, she understood this moment better than he did, and that realization did not weaken him. It sharpened him, his eyes scanning ahead, identifying the opening she was building, a narrow path toward the side corridor leading to the service exit, not obvious, not direct, but possible, if timed perfectly, and timing was everything now. One of the men shifted again, abandoning caution, trying to force control back into the situation. But in doing so, he broke the last piece of coordination holding them together, and that was all Amara needed. Her movement this time was not hidden, not masked by routine. It was clear, decisive, a step forward that placed her directly between Vincent and the closing angle, her posture firm, her presence undeniable. And for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, because the invisible maid was no longer invisible. She was standing in the center of something she had no right to control, and yet she controlled it anyway. Vincent did not hesitate. Not this time. He moved through the space she created, his stride calm, controlled, passing within inches of her without a word, without a glance, because words would have slowed him. And slowing down was no longer an option. Behind them, the tension snapped completely, not into chaos, but into confusion. The 5 men no longer moving as one, their focus broken, their objective slipping out of reach. And in the quiet aftermath of that shift, Amara finally exhaled, just once, her shoulders lowering by the smallest degree, her eyes still tracking, still calculating, because she knew this was not over, not yet, but the balance had changed. And for the first time that night, the outcome was no longer certain, and neither was she. because the role she had hidden behind for so long had just been shattered in front of a room full of witnesses, and there was no going back to invisibility now. Vincent reached the service corridor without breaking stride, his pace controlled, his breathing even, but his mind was no longer focused on escape alone. It was recalibrating around a new variable he had not accounted for, the woman behind him, because nothing about what had just happened aligned with coincidence. Nothing about her movements suggested improvisation, and men like Vincent did not survive by ignoring patterns that did not make sense. The corridor was narrower, dimmer, the polished luxury of the dining room giving way to steel surfaces and muted lighting. The air cooler, quieter, but the tension followed, carried in the footsteps that echoed faintly behind him, not synchronized anymore, but still present, still adapting, and Vincent slowed just enough to assess, his hand no longer near his jacket, but relaxed at his side, ready, aware, listening, because the situation had shifted from containment to pursuit, and that required a different kind of control. Back in the dining room, Amara remained where she stood for half a second longer than necessary, her eyes tracking the aftermath of the disruption she had created. The five men were no longer unified, but they were not defeated, their attention snapping between Vincent's retreat and the woman who had interfered. And in that moment of divided focus, she understood something critical. They would split, not all of them, but enough to maintain pressure. And if Vincent continued alone, the balance would tilt again. Her jaw tightened slightly, not from fear, but from decision, because walking away now would mean returning to the safety of invisibility, to the role she had maintained for years, a role that demanded silence, demanded distance, demanded survival above all else. And yet her feet moved before that thought could settle, carrying her forward with the same quiet precision she had used all night. But this time there was no hiding it, no disguising it as routine. The room watched her now, the staff frozen, the guests silent, eyes following. The maid who was no longer behaving like one, and she did not look back, not at them, not at the life she was leaving behind with every step. The corridor entrance loomed ahead, and as she crossed the threshold, the noise of the dining room faded into a distant murmur, replaced by the sharper clarity of a confined space. Vincent heard her before he saw her, the soft, steady rhythm of footsteps that did not belong to the men behind him, footsteps that matched his pace without trying to overtake him, and that alone told him everything he needed to know. He did not turn immediately. He did not acknowledge her presence with words, because in moments like this, words were unnecessary. Instead, he adjusted his position slightly, creating space beside him, an unspoken recognition, an acceptance of something he would not have allowed just minutes ago. Amara stepped into that space without hesitation, her gaze forward, her expression unchanged, but inside, everything was different. The corridor narrowed ahead, leading to a service exit that opened into a dimly lit alley, the kind of place where control could be regained or lost entirely, depending on who reached it first. Her mind mapped the next sequence before they even reached the door, the angles, the timing, the likelihood of interception, and most importantly, the fact that this was no longer about avoiding attention. It was about ending the pattern before it reset. Vincent finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, carrying the weight of someone who was used to being obeyed, but tempered now by something else, something closer to curiosity than command. You saw them before I did. It was not a question, and for a brief moment, Amara considered saying nothing, returning to silence, to invisibility, but that option no longer existed, not after what she had already revealed. Her voice when it came was calm, steady, carrying none of the hesitation expected from someone in her position. They were not looking at you. They were looking around you. Vincent's eyes narrowed slightly, processing the statement, understanding it instantly, because it meant she had not just seen the threat, she had understood the strategy behind it, and that changed everything. The door ahead came into view, and as Vincent reached for it, he realized something that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. He was no longer leading this moment alone, and the most dangerous variable in the room was not the men who had followed him, but the woman walking beside him, the one he had almost dismissed as nothing at all. The door opened with a muted push, revealing the alley beyond, a narrow stretch of concrete framed by brick walls and dim security lights that cast long shadows across the ground. The kind of place where elegance disappeared and truth took its place, where the illusion of control could not hide behind polished surfaces. And Vincent stepped through first, his eyes scanning instantly, adjusting to the shift in environment. The open space both a risk and an opportunity, his senses sharpening as the faint echo of footsteps behind them confirmed what Amara had already predicted. They had followed, not all five, but enough to keep pressure, enough to force a decision, and that decision had to be made now, not in seconds, but in moments measured by instinct rather than thought. Amara moved beside him, her posture no longer reserved, no longer constrained by the role she had played inside. The quiet uniform she wore now felt like a disguise that no longer fit, her gaze sweeping the alley. With precision, noting the distance to the exit gate, the placement of a parked delivery truck 15 feet to the right, the narrow gap between dumpsters on the left that could serve as cover or trap depending on timing. Every detail cataloged instantly. And then she stopped, not abruptly, but with intention, her hand lifting slightly, not touching Vincent, but signaling him without words, and he understood, not because she explained, but because the confidence in her movement demanded trust. His steps slowed, his body angling just enough to align with her positioning, no longer questioning why, only recognizing that she was already 3 steps ahead in a situation he was still calculating. The footsteps behind them grew clearer, closer, no longer concealed by the noise of the restaurant. And in that sound was urgency, not chaos, but adaptation. The men had adjusted again, abandoning subtlety entirely. And that meant the pattern had changed for the final time. Amara's eyes narrowed slightly as she turned her head just enough to catch the reflection of movement in a darkened window across the alley. 3 figures now, spaced differently, moving with intent, but without the earlier coordination. And that told her everything she needed to know. Their plan had failed, and now they were operating on instinct, which made them unpredictable, but also less controlled. And less controlled meant more openings. Vincent spoke again, quieter this time, not as a command, but as an acknowledgement. This was planned, and Amara's response came just as steady, just as certain. Not for tonight, for you. The words settled between them with weight, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but precise, and Vincent absorbed them without reaction, because reacting would have wasted time, and time was the only thing they did not have. The alley seemed to narrow as the figures approached, the distance closing, the air tightening, and yet Amara did not step back. She did not retreat toward the exit. Instead, she shifted her position, slightly to the side, aligning herself with the parked truck, her mind already mapping the next sequence, not escape, not avoidance, but resolution, because she understood something Vincent was only beginning to realize. Running would only extend the pattern, it would not end it, and ending it required control, not distance. Her voice broke the silence one more time, low, calm, carrying no trace of doubt. Stay behind me for 2 seconds. Vincent's eyes flicked toward her, just once, measuring, assessing, and in that glance, the last barrier of disbelief fell away, because nothing about her suggested uncertainty, nothing about her movement suggested hesitation, and men like Vincent recognized that kind of certainty, not as arrogance, but as experience. He gave the smallest nod, not submission, but agreement, and stepped back half a pace, placing himself exactly where she needed him to be. The figures were close now, their presence no longer distant, no longer abstract, and in that moment, the roles that had defined the night dissolved completely. The Mafia Boss was no longer the center of control, and the maid was no longer invisible, because as Amara took one final step forward, positioning herself between Vincent and the approaching threat, there was no trace left of the woman who had once moved unnoticed through the dining room. Only the quiet, unshakable presence of someone who had done this before, someone who understood exactly how the next 2 seconds would decide everything. And for the first time that night, Vincent Romano did not try to take control, he simply watched. The air in the alley tightened into something almost tangible, a quiet pressure that pressed against every movement, every breath, and in that space between intention and action, Amara did not rush, she did not react, she executed, her body shifting forward with a calm that did not belong in a moment like this, her steps measured in inches, not feet, each one placed with precision that suggested rehearsal, not improvisation. And the three men approaching felt it before they understood it. The subtle disruption of expectation. The way their advance no longer dictated the rhythm of the moment, because the woman in front of them was not retreating, not hesitating, not behaving like someone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was positioning. Vincent remained half a step behind her, exactly where she had instructed, his eyes locked on her movements, not in confusion, but in focused observation. Because what she was doing did not resemble instinct alone, it resembled training, the kind of training that rewrote how a person saw space, how they measured distance, how they controlled time itself. And in that realization, something shifted inside him, not fear, not doubt, but recognition of a truth he could no longer ignore. She was not an anomaly. She was something deliberate, something shaped by a past he could only begin to imagine. Amara's gaze flicked once to the left, then back to center, tracking the lead figure's shoulders, the angle of his approach, the slight hesitation in his stride as he recalculated her presence. And that hesitation was the opening she had been waiting for. Her movement came then, not fast in the way panic moves, but fast in the way certainty moves, a single step forward that altered the distance between them just enough to break there. Timing again, her hand lifted, not striking, not aggressive, but intercepting, redirecting, her motion guided by angles rather than force. And in that redirection, the momentum of the approach collapsed into confusion. The second man adjusted too late. The third paused, their coordination dissolving into individual reactions instead of unified intent. Vincent saw it happen in fragments, not fully understanding each motion, but understanding the result. Control was slipping from them entirely. And it was happening without noise, without spectacle, without anything that would draw attention from the street beyond the alley. It was quiet, precise, contained, and in that containment was dominance. Amara did not stop. She moved through the space she had created, guiding the flow of motion away from Vincent, her positioning forcing distance, forcing separation, her presence dictating where the tension could and could not exist. And for a brief moment, everything aligned, not in chaos, but in resolution. The three men no longer advancing, no longer closing the gap, their intent disrupted beyond immediate recovery. And in that silence, broken only by the faint hum of the city beyond the alley, the outcome settled into place. Vincent stepped forward then, not because he needed to act, but because the moment allowed it, his posture straightening, his presence reasserting itself, but not in opposition to hers, alongside it. His voice when it came was low, controlled, carrying a weight that acknowledged what had just happened without needing to explain it. You are not just a maid. The statement hung in the air, simple, undeniable, and Amara did not respond immediately, her eyes still scanning, still confirming that the sequence had ended, that no further movement would follow. And when she finally turned her head slightly, her expression unchanged, her voice calm. It carried none of the pride or defiance that might have been expected, only truth. I never was. And in that moment, standing in a narrow alley under dim lights, the illusion that had defined the entire night disappeared completely, leaving behind only what had always been there, a man who had built power through control, and a woman who had mastered it in silence, and the quiet understanding that from this point forward, neither of them would ever see the world the same way again. The alley did not return to silence immediately. It settled into it slowly, like a room remembering how to breathe after holding tension for too long. The distant hum of traffic filtering back in, the faint flicker of a streetlight casting uneven shadows along the brick walls. And in the center of it all, Vincent Romano stood still, not because he had nothing to do, but because for the first time in years, action was no longer the most important response. Understanding was. His gaze remained on Amara, not with suspicion, not with dominance, but with something far more deliberate. He was studying her the way he studied everything that had the potential to change his world, and she felt it, not as pressure, but as recognition, the kind that could not be undone once it had formed. Her posture relaxed slightly, not in weakness, but in completion. The sequence had ended, the pattern broken, the outcome secured, and there was nothing left to calculate, nothing left to control, only the consequences of what had been revealed behind them. The figures who had once moved with purpose were no longer advancing. their presence reduced to uncertainty, to the quiet realization that whatever had been planned had already slipped beyond recovery. And that realization carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. Vincent took a single step forward, closing the small distance between them. His voice, when it came, was softer now, not lacking authority, but reshaped by something new. You could have walked away. It was not an accusation, not even a question. It was a statement of fact, and Amara's eyes met his for the first time without lowering, without hesitation, because there was no longer a reason to hide behind the role she had carried for so long. Her answer was simple, steady, carrying no need for justification. I almost did. The truth of it settled between them, quiet but undeniable. And Vincent nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried more acknowledgement than words ever could, because he understood what it meant to choose involvement over safety, to step into something that could not be undone. And in that shared understanding, the distance between power and humility shifted, not erased, but redefined. The door behind them creaked open slightly as faint voices from the restaurant began to spill into the alley, staff searching, security finally responding, the world catching up to a moment that had already passed. And with that sound, reality returned, the roles, the expectations, the consequences. Amara's gaze flicked briefly toward the door, then back to Vincent, and for a second, the question lingered unspoken. What happens now? Vincent answered it without being asked, not with a command, not with a demand, but with a decision that surprised even himself. From this moment forward, no one in my house calls you invisible. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of authority that shaped entire lives. And yet there was no ownership in them, no claim, only recognition. Amara held his gaze for a second longer, then gave the slightest nod, not gratitude, not submission, but acceptance of a truth that had already been earned. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, voices sharper, and the moment between them began to close, not because it was finished, but because the world did not allow stillness to last. Vincent turned slightly, preparing to step back into the role that had defined him for years, but something in his expression had changed, something that could not be undone. And as Amara stepped away, her figure once again moving toward the edges of the scene, no longer hiding, but no longer needing to stand at the center either. The alley seemed to exhale one final time, the tension dissolving completely, leaving behind only the quiet imprint of what had happened there. And as the night resumed its rhythm beyond the narrow space, one truth remained, unspoken but undeniable, that power had been redefined in a place where no one had been looking, and that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.